you need the right camera for travel. On this list, I'm going to show you the best cameras for travel. Cameras that are small and compact, but still offer strong image quality. Also, if you're new to the channel, we review dozens of cameras on this channel every single year. So whether you're a beginner or a pro, I've got you covered with the perfect camera. And as always, I'm gonna leave links in the description down below for the most up-to-date pricing and the most current pricing on all of the products that we talk about today. And the first camera on this list is the Canon M50. The M50 is an ideal beginner camera for 90% of the people watching this video. And that's because it has most of the features that people need in a travel camera, but it also comes at a great price point, which makes it a really great deal. But one thing to note, the Canon M50 actually has two versions, the Canon M50 Mark I and the Canon M50 Mark II. But don't worry, both cameras are very similar in terms of features and very close in price point. There's only small differences. So for starters, let's talk about the features in these cameras and what makes them so good for travel. Both cameras have a 24 megapixel sensor that delivers sharp and detailed photos and videos. The great thing about Canon cameras is the color science. The colors right in camera look amazing. You almost don't need to edit your photos and videos. This is really useful for those tricky sunset shots or landscape shots where you need the colors to look just right. When it comes to photos, both cameras shoot 10 frames per second, which is fast enough for really any kind of subject matter, whether it's something stationary like landscapes or something fast moving like sports. When you're traveling, you often only have one chance to get your photo, so having a fast photo rate is really helpful. Along with that, the Canon M50 also has 14-bit RAW, which allows for a ton of flexibility if you plan on editing your photos in Lightroom or Photoshop. And the autofocus is where both M50 cameras really shine. They have Canon's dual pixel autofocus, which is fast and reliable for both photos and videos. It has intelligent face tracking and intelligent object tracking, but the Mark II has intelligent face tracking, object tracking, and it has intelligent eye tracking, which also makes the autofocus about 30% faster and more accurate. Both the M50 Mark I and Mark II are great choices for people that mainly want to focus on video while traveling. Both M50 cameras shoot Full HD at 24 and 30 frames per second, which is real time. And they shoot 60 frames per second in Full HD for 2x slow motion. Now, there is 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion, which looks epic, but at that frame rate, the camera drops down to 720p resolution, which is lower than Full HD. Now, both M50 cameras do have 4K at 24 frames per second. However, in 4K mode, it's pretty much pushing both cameras to their very limit. So in 4K mode, it actually crops into your sensor, basically zooms in your image, which makes it really hard to get wide shots. But on top of that, that stellar autofocus I was talking about earlier gets really slow and kind of unreliable. I don't think 4K is the main shooting mode for this camera, but it's a pretty nice feature to have for detail shots and product shots. But have no fear, if you are someone that definitely wants to shoot in 4K, there are cameras later in this list with stellar 4K, and I specifically picked them out for their amazing 4K capabilities. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is the design of the Canon M50, because when you're traveling, you want something that's small and compact and has the right ergonomics so that it's easy to use while you're on the road. The M50 definitely has one thing covered, and that's the fact that it is really small, compact, and it's a very light camera. This is a camera you can easily keep in your hands all day without feeling tired. And it has one of the most important features when it comes to travel cameras, and that is a side articulating screen. This makes it easy to not only film yourself, but it's also really helpful for shooting high angles and low angles. The side articulating screen is also a touch screen. You can operate the entire camera just using the touchscreen. And on top of that, the touchscreen also allows for touch autofocus, which simply makes your life a whole lot easier. You don't have to fiddle with your camera trying to get focus. It makes this camera about as complicated as using a smartphone. And overall, the M50 has really minimal buttons and really minimal menus. You can easily pick up this camera, get great results without too much of a hassle. Plus, it has an input for external audio. The M50 is a great budget camera choice because it delivers stunning image quality while staying small and compact enough for travel. But if you're someone who definitely wants 4K or simply wants more horsepower in their camera, the next two cameras are exactly what you're looking for. Let's look at the Sony ZV-E10, which is currently my favorite budget camera and also my favorite travel camera. What makes the Sony ZV-E10 such a great camera? Well, before I get into it, there's a quick disclaimer. The Sony ZV-E10 is pretty hard to find right now. However, I do expect it to be back on shelves later this year. So let's still talk about the ZV-E10, but I'm going to give you recommendations for other Sony cameras that are almost the same in terms of price and features with small, very small design changes. The Sony ZV-E10 has a 24 megapixel APS-C size sensor. However, what makes the sensor in Sony cameras special is that they are extremely good at low light. So if you're someone that's traveling, doesn't really have access to proper lighting, A lot of times you're shooting in dark environments, this camera is going to be clutch. Most cameras have a top ISO of 3200, after which it looks pretty terrible. However, Sony cameras can give you great images as high as 10,000 or even 20,000 ISO in both photos and video. Sony cameras are easily the best when it comes to low light performance. The Sony ZV-E10 shoots photos at 10 frames per second, which is fast enough to capture any kind of action while traveling. The autofocus in Sony cameras is god level. It is extremely fast and very reliable. The Sony cameras have AI-based autofocus, yes, artificial intelligence-based face tracking, eye tracking, object tracking. This is probably the best camera you can get if autofocus is something you really care about. And good autofocus really matters for people that are mainly shooting video. So next, let's talk about the video features in this camera. The Sony ZV-E10 has some of the best 4K that you can get at this price point. It does 4K at 24 frames per second with no crop, and 4K at 30 with a teeny tiny crop that I promise you will not notice. And the 4K is super sampled from 6K, so you get the sharpness and detail of a 6K image, but in an easy to manage 4K package. And when it comes to Full HD, it still does 24 and 30 frames per second, but with a slow motion mode of 60 frames per second for 2x slow motion and 120 frames per second for 5x slow motion. But not only that, the Sony ZV-E10 also has cinema profiles built right in, so that you can easily create a cinematic look with your travel videos. The ZV-E10 is really a pro camera, but in an entry-level category. However, when it comes to design, that's what really sets the Sony ZV-E10 apart. The ZV-E10 has a small and compact body with a minimal button layout. The minimal button layout makes it easier to get familiar with this camera, but most importantly, the layout is better for someone who wants to film and shoot themselves. There's a record button placed right at the front of the camera, and it's even slanted so that you can easily hit it while you're on the front side of the camera. Also, it has a side articulating screen so that you can easily film yourself and see exactly what your camera sees. Sadly, the touchscreen capabilities on the ZV-E10 are not as good as the Canon M50. But one thing that I love about the ZV-E10 is the phenomenal internal audio, which is almost as good as an external shotgun mic. This camera is going to give you great audio internally no matter what. But what about the elephant in the room? What if you can't find a Sony ZV-E10? In that case, I highly recommend picking up the Sony a6400. The internals on the a6400 are almost the same, but it has a design that's closer to a more traditional Sony camera, and the flip screen actually comes up to the top instead of the side like the ZV-E10. And if the two factors I mentioned aren't deal breakers for you, I think you'll get amazing results with the a6400 if you don't feel like waiting for a ZV-E10 to come back on the market. Overall, I recommend the Sony ZV-E10 or the a6400 to someone that's really passionate about taking photos and videos while traveling, and you want to maybe even edit your photos and videos when you come back. However, what if you want a travel camera that has no compromises, gives you a ton of horsepower, and has the magical ability to make all of your photos and videos look amazing right in camera? In that case, let's talk about the Fuji X-T30 Mark II and the Fuji X-S10. Both cameras are really close in features, and I'm talking about both of them because they're only about $100 apart. The Fuji X-T30 is slightly better for photos, where the X-S10 is specifically made with video shooters in mind. In my opinion, the Fuji cameras are perfectly suited for capturing your memories while traveling. What makes Fuji cameras so special are the built-in colors. All Fuji cameras have built-in film emulations. These are color profiles which mimic the look of 35mm Fuji film. This one feature alone helps make your photos and videos stand out right in camera. Because how many times have you taken a photo of like the most beautiful thing on your trip and you look at it in camera and you're like, this does not look like what I just saw. These cameras make sure that you capture your travel moments perfectly by giving your photos and videos a really cool look. Now, both the Fuji X-T30 Mark II and the Fuji X-S10 have a 26 megapixel X-Trans sensor, which is specifically made to mimic the feel and texture of 35mm film. And the autofocus in both the X-T30 and X-S10 is spectacular. Fuji isn't really known for their autofocusing system, but over the last years, starting with the X-T4, the autofocus has gone significantly better. In both cameras, the object tracking and face tracking is pretty impressive. It's almost as good as the Canon dual pixel autofocus. However, let's talk about the specs and technology in this camera. In photo mode, it does 8 frames per second in mechanical shutter mode, which isn't bad at all, but it's a little slow for travel. Thankfully, it has an electronic shutter mode, which allows you to shoot 20 or even 30 frames per second which is double the M50. In this mode, it is shooting photos as fast as a video frame rate, which makes it almost impossible to miss a shot. However, in electronic shutter mode, there is a teeny tiny crop of 1.2, which most of you guys probably won't notice, and the faster shutter speed is definitely worth it. And when it comes to video, both the Fuji X-T30 and the X-S10 shoot 4K at 200 megabits per second. The higher data rate is actually going to give you better 4K than most of its competition out there, and the 4K in this camera is actually good enough for professional level work, and the extra data is going to give you lots of room to adjust your colors later on in editing. Both cameras have F-Log and Fuji ETERNA profiles. These are flat profiles that give you more dynamic range and more flexibility when it comes to editing your videos. However, when it comes to shooting full HD resolution, that's where these cameras get really interesting. Both cameras shoot at 24 and 30 frames per second, but they also allow for 240 frames per second for 10 times slow motion. However, at 240 frames per second, your video quality does take a hit, but this is still such an amazing feature to have in a camera at this price point. In case you're someone that's making a lot of content while traveling, slow motion is such a key thing for making travel videos. And finally, let's talk about design, because that's where the Fuji X-T30 really differentiates itself from the X-S10. The Fuji X-T30 Mark II is more retro and has more of a nostalgic design to it. The buttons and dials on the Fuji X-T30 are more similar to the cameras from 50s and 60s because they want to give you a more nostalgic, more of a retro feel to your camera. However, it still has all the modern buttons and dials that you would want on a modern camera, so don't feel like you're not going to be able to figure this camera out or it's going to have some kind of old backward design. And the Fuji X-T30 is really better suited for photographers. However, it still does spectacular video. The Fuji X-S10 is really made for video shooters in mind, so the buttons and dials on this camera are really similar to most modern video cameras. However, there is one key difference that sets the X-T30 and the X-S10 apart. The X-S10 actually has 5-axis stabilization, which is super useful for video shooters, and you pay a little bit more, about $100 more for that stabilization. The X-S10 has a side articulating screen, which is better for video shooters, and the X-T30 does not have that screen. So if you're shooting photos and if you're used to retro cameras, the X-T30 might be a better fit for you, and if you're shooting videos and you're more used to modern cameras, the X-S10 might be a better fit for you. However, both cameras are super similar in specs, and you're going to get a great travel camera either way. With the combination of sensor, frame rates, and color science, there is very little that you cannot do with the Fuji cameras. So if you want your videos to go from looking like this to this, and your photos to go from looking like this to this, then be sure to check out the free training in the description down below. I put together my 7 simple secrets that show you exactly how to get the most out of the gear that you're using right now, even if that gear is a smartphone. So take the easy step to learn how to really improve your work today. Make sure to check out the link in the description down below.